Uh, so let's now begin. I'm going to share my screen and let's join together in the blessing for study. You're stuck with me for today. If you'd like to unmute, you can join me in this blessing and we'll begin. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the one whose mitzvot, whose commandments make our lives holy, and who commands us to engage in, to immerse in words of Torah. So I was thinking about hope, and I decided to bring you one of my very favorite stories from the Talmud today. And this is the story of a rabbi meeting the Messiah. Why the Messiah? In Judaism, the Messiah in many ways is the symbol of hope, the symbol of that belief that the world can become better. So in this story, which by the way is one of these outlandish Talmudic stories where rabbis do magical things, in this story we have a rabbi coming face to face with the Messiah. And I wanted to spend our half hour today unpacking this story together. So this comes from the Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, which is what Bavli means, Tractate Sanhedrin 98b, and it is a story about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who is an early Amora, meaning he lives after the destruction of the temple and also after the creation of the Mishnah in around the 4th century. And in this story, we're told, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi found Elijah the prophet. So I'll stop already and just ask you to help me unpack what's the significance of Elijah the prophet? What are some of the meaning? Yeah, Anne, go ahead. Tell me about Elijah the prophet.
Well, he was so loved by God that he was taken up to heaven. He didn't actually die.
Right. Yes, the Tanakh doesn't say anything about his death, right? And so Elijah the prophet is considered so beloved of God. Bob, you had a comment as well. Go ahead.
The chariot that has all the mythical beasts.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's some mythical stuff there associated with him. Go ahead, Bob.
He's supposed to be the one who comes to announce the what we're talking about here, the Messiah, and that's why you put out a cup for Elijah at the Seder.
Exactly. Right. So every year we put out a cup for Elijah at our Seder and we sing to him Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Elijah the prophet, the Tishbite, the Giladite. And then the next line of the song says, Bimhera b'yameinu yavo eleinu, may he soon come to us, im Mashiach ben David, with the Messiah, the descendant of David. So Elijah the prophet is the harbinger of the Messiah. He's the one who announces that the Messiah is coming into the world. And that is exactly the role that he plays in this story. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi meets Elijah. We're jumping to the second paragraph here. And he says to Elijah, when will the Messiah come? Wouldn't we all like to be able to ask Elijah that question? Well, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi actually gets to. And Elijah said to him, this is my favorite, go ask him. Why don't you ask him yourself? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, where is he sitting? Elijah says to him, at the entrance of the city. And the city here means the city of Rome, which is, of course, the great city of ancient times, the capital of the Roman Empire, the great metropolis of Rome. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked him, and what is his identifying sign? In other words, there's a lot of people sitting at the entrance of Rome. How will I know which one is the Messiah? And Elijah answered, he sits among the poor who suffer from illnesses, and all of them untie their bandages and tie them all at once. But he unties one bandage and ties one at a time. He says, perhaps I will be needed, so I will not be delayed. In other words, Elijah is sitting amongst the lepers, right? That's the sickness that we're probably talking about here. And lepers wear bandages over various parts of their bodies, and they have to replace those bandages because they become infected or dirty. You have to tie and untie and wash your bandages and things like that. And so Elijah says all the other lepers, they take off all their bandages, They wash their body, they wash their bandages, and they put on all their bandages, but not the Messiah. The Messiah takes off one bandage at a time and then replaces it, and then does another bandage and replaces it. Why? So that when he is called, when it's time for the Messiah to come into the world, he will not be delayed. He won't have to wait so long as rewrapping his entire body in bandages. So what's surprising here? That's only the first half of the story, by the way. But what's surprising, what's interesting about what jumps out about this story of the Messiah? Any reactions? Bob, go ahead.
Well, we have to acknowledge that this is in the Christian era, but it starts out with an individual who is at the lowest possible point, not a baby, but still a nothing, less than a nothing, a despised individual, and yet one who realizes his potential mission, and it goes from there. So it sets the stage of the idea that you can rise from degradation to great glory.
You mean when you say, you mean that he's a leper, right? In other words, you might have expected the Messiah to be powerful and good looking, but instead he's a lowly leper. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, that's part of it. And it sort of goes with the other idea of how do you know when the Messianic era has arrived? And the one rabbi says to the other, they're walking in the dark, and he says, you see that little bit of light there before the dawn? Well, that's going to be it. So it's a very sneaky kind of a situation that could lead to this theoretical change of the world.
Which relates maybe to what Rick put in the chat, which is that we have to be prepared at any moment, right? That the Messiah here is prepared at any moment for that change, for the work that he is supposed to do in the world. So I see a few hands. I see Anne, and then Susan, and then Carol.
And it also shows that the Messiah, when he's waiting to be called, is not with the rich and the mighty. He's with the poor and the desperate. And in our worst moments is when we call for him.
Right. It reminds me of what some of us are studying in Pirkei Avot, where it says, Ezehu Ashir, who is rich, the one who is happy with what they have. Who is powerful, the one who can control their own impulses. In other words, to be rich, powerful, wise isn't about having a lot, amassing a lot. It's about giving to others. It's about controlling yourself rather than controlling others, learning from others. Who is wise? The one who learns from others. So the Messiah here is exemplifying this value that wealth and power are actually much more about the spiritual than about the material. Susan, go ahead, and then Carol.
Well, thank you, Anne. You just said exactly what I was going to say, but I have a couple other comments. It seems to me that this person who is the unknown Messiah does not suffer from illness himself, but that he is taking care of people who do need their bandages changed. And I could be mistaken about that. The other thing is that I remember from Torah that generally leprosy is a metaphor for any kind of ailment, or physical or spiritual. So this person could be, with his hand said, the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor, also, as Bob said, the poorest of the poor. And he is tending to their spiritual wounds. And you can probably only attend to one spiritual wound at a time. You can't just rip them all off and say, okay, here you go. Because people would have nervous breakdowns.
It's pretty good advice for therapy, right? You can't deal with all your
Absolutely.
problems at
My
once.
therapist always used to say it's like peeling an onion.
Yeah, that's great. So we don't have an indication here. It's necessarily, you could read it either way. He does seem to be changing his own bandages. So there's some indication that the Messiah might be one of the lepers, but also you could understand the Messiah sitting amongst the lepers as the Messiah ministering to the lepers. If the Messiah is one of the lepers, then there's an additional message, and that's the message of the Messiah doesn't have to be perfect. If leprosy in biblical thinking is associated with our own wrongs, like for example, Miriam gossips and then she gets leprosy, that means the Messiah is not some saint, right? The Messiah is not a perfect figure. The Messiah is an imperfect person who also has the capacity to bring tikkun, to bring repair into the world, which is another great message for all of us imperfect people. I don't know about all of you. I have a few flaws myself, right? So in other words, the Messiah is not some perfect person. The Messiah is just one of us who can do something to make the world a little better. And we'll see that message get deepened actually in the second part of the story. Carol, go ahead, and then I think we'll move on in the story.
I've got a question.
Mhm.
I know no question's stupid, but we're assuming here that the Messiah has a physical body. That is not the concept that I have grown up with.
Great. So hang on to that because we're getting to it at the end. It's not the concept I've grown up with either. And let me just say, I'm not here trying to teach us that there has to be a personal Messiah. We're using a story, a traditional Messiah story, in order to talk about what is hope and what does it mean to repair the world. So we're going to get there. In fact, the story will now go there in a way. So remember, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi has gone to the gates of Rome. It's worth pointing out also, where is the Messiah? In Rome, not Jerusalem, right? You might have thought Jerusalem, but no, this is Rome because the Messiah lives among the people. Yehoshua ben Levi goes to the gates of Rome and finds the Messiah. And we read, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi went to the Messiah. He said to the Messiah, "Greetings to you, my rabbi and my teacher." The Messiah said to him, "Greetings to you, Bar Levi." That's the name of his father. He's Yehoshua ben Levi, right? The son of Levi. So Bar Levi is the Aramaic way of saying ben Levi. "Greetings to you, Bar Levi." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to him, "When will the master come?" The Messiah said to him, "Today." This feels like good news, right? The Messiah is coming today. But almost immediately, the story says sometime later. So we have some kind of a hint here that the Messiah didn't come today. Maybe we could have known that anyway just by looking around at the world around us, right? The Messiah hasn't come today, but the Messiah said, "I'm coming today." So we have a problem. What's the problem? The Messiah lied. He said he was coming, and then he didn't come. What are we supposed to do with that? So sometime later, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi came to Elijah. Lucky guy, he met Elijah twice. Elijah said to him, "What did the Messiah say to you?" He said to Elijah that the Messiah said, "Shalom, greetings to you, Bar Levi." Elijah said to him, "He thereby guaranteed that you and your father will enter the world to come by greeting with you with shalom and mentioning the name of your father." That, by the way, the story starts with Yehoshua ben Levi asking Elijah, "Will I get to enter the world to come?" So he's got his answer. We skipped that part, but he's now got his answer to that. However, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi goes on. He says to Elijah, "The Messiah lied to me. He said, 'I'm coming today,' and he did not come." Elijah said to him, "No, this is what he said to you." He was quoting Psalms. Hayom im b'kolo tishma'u. Today, if you will listen to God's voice. So somebody explain to us, what's the message, what's the story, what's the device that's being used here to get across what the Messiah said? Anne, go ahead.
Well, according to the Torah and the Talmud, the Messiah comes when we've all reached a point of following all the rules and becoming a holy people. And that's when there's peace on earth and the lion lies down with the lamb and all of that. And that's when the Messiah will come, when we're worthy, when we're worthy of him.
So the Messiah, the message here from the Messiah is Hayom, today, could be any day, right? That today, if you will hear God's voice, in other words, you have the power to bring the Messiah. You have the power to bring the Messianic age. And there's any day is potentially the day. Every time you ask the Messiah, when is he coming? The answer is Hayom, today. But it's always that conditional Hayom. It's always the Hayom, the today of if you will listen to God's voice, which, by the way, comes from Psalm 95, as you see here, from a psalm that we sing on Friday nights in Kabbalat Shabbat. Traditionally, the opening of the Kabbalat Shabbat service is a series of psalms, and this is one of the ones that we sing where it says, God talks about how we're so stiff-necked, and if only we would listen, and so today, if you would listen to God's voice, in other words, you have work to do in this world. Susan, go ahead, and then Bob.
What I think of when I read this is, I don't know, I was in this place and I did not know.
Tell me how that relates. Tell me more.
Well, here's Jacob out in the wilderness, and he has a dream about these angels ascending and descending, or in whichever direction they're going, round and round. And he wakes up and he says, oh my, I didn't realize it, but God was here.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was sleeping. Now, was he physically sleeping or was he spiritually asleep? I take it to mean he was spiritually asleep, and that he had some kind of awakening and was able to acknowledge that God was in his presence, or he was in the presence of God. And in this case, Elijah said, he said he didn't say he was coming that day. He said he guaranteed that you and your father would enter the world to come. So I don't, there it is. The Messiah said today. Well, to the Messiah, today can mean any day.
Right. Yeah. So this spiritual, I like that, the spiritual awakening of knowing, by the way, the Messiah is right here sitting at the gate of Rome. The point wasn't to wait. The point was to do the work of bringing the Messiah into the world. And that's where we get to Carol's objection, right? Is there a Messiah? Is there an actual person called Messiah? Or is this a story about our responsibility to do the work that brings the Messiah into the world, which is to say, to do the work of bringing about the Messianic age? Bob, go ahead, and then I want to show you somebody that'll take us in that direction.
Well, two things. One is, and I relate to other stories too, just as Susan did, pray as if everything depends upon God and act as if everything depends upon you. And that is sort of the message here. But it's his voice. The translation doesn't indicate that it's God, and I don't see anything one way or the other in the Hebrew. But an interesting aspect of this, if it applies, is that the voice that we should be attending to is not coming to us from up in heaven. It's coming from the Messiah, who is this sick and degraded, ugly-looking beggar at the gate.
Yeah. So when does the Messiah come? When does the tikkun happen in our olam? When we listen to the people who don't have voices, right? When we, instead of walking around the homeless person, we see them as a human being. When we learn to stop dehumanizing the other because they look different, because they are sick, because they are poor, for whatever reason, all these reasons that we dehumanize them. If you see them as the Messiah, then you might treat them different. There's a whole genre of stories that also relate to this, where Elijah the prophet will dress up as a beggar and walk around seeing how people treat him. And Elijah goes up to the house and people treat him really kindly and nicely, and then he reveals himself, I'm Elijah the prophet, and you didn't even know it. And then at other houses, people tell him to go away, right? He's a poor beggar, get out of here. And he turns out to be Elijah the prophet. So the idea here, to some extent, is treat everybody as if they were the Messiah. Treat everybody as if they were the most important person in the world. And when we learn to do that, then the Messiah will really come, right? Then the Messianic age will come. I think it's a beautiful idea, Bob, that you've added into our discussion there. So let's make that leap then. Carol objected earlier, wait a minute, I don't believe in a Messiah, a person that is the Messiah. Well, Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism largely teaches us that the Messiah is not a person, but rather an age or a responsibility. And that comes to us via Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen is an early 20th century German Jewish philosopher and thinker. He lived his entire life in Germany and died in the late teens, maybe around 1919, 1920. So he never got to see what happened to his beloved German Jewish community. But Hermann Cohen's ideas were very, very influential in early Reform Judaism. And he believed very much in this idea that we have a responsibility to live in the world among the nations and to strive to make the world a better place wherever it is that we are living. And he called that the Messiah. So this is from Reason and Hope. Reason and Hope is not a book of Cohen's, but rather a sort of a compilation of different writings of Cohen's. And he writes as follows, and I'd love to get your reaction to this as well. He writes, Judaism's social idealism is related to its messianism. The first to conceive of the idea of universal peace and place their confidence in it as world history's purpose and meaning were the prophets. Indeed, it is this concept that made them true teachers of the love for one's fellow man, fellow human. He's writing in, 1900. War is the Satan of world history. To think as the ancient Greeks did, that war is the father of the world, representing the true meaning of life and the inevitable fate of nations and individuals, is both a mockery of the idea of God as, again, he's using masculine language, God as father, God as parent of all people, and a contradiction of the concept of humanity as an end in himself and a final purpose. He who believes in perpetual peace believes in the Messiah, and not in a Messiah who has already come, but in one who must and will come. There's a little dig at Christianity at the end there, a Messiah that has already come, but also there's a dig at anybody who believes that there isn't still work to do. In other words, Cohen is saying the Messiah is always in the future. No matter how good the world is, no matter how much you think you're making progress, you're fixing the world, you're making things better, the Messiah is always in the future. To suggest that the Messiah has already come is a blasphemy, he says, as far as Judaism is concerned, because it suggests that we no longer have any work to do. Rather, the Messiah is an embodiment of the idea that human beings always have work to do, that we always have both the responsibility and here's where the hope comes in, the capacity to make the world a better place. You sit around waiting for the Messiah will never come. But if you do the work of bringing the Messiah, then the Messiah comes because you make the world better. Susan, go ahead. Susan, you're muted.
Okay. I remember one time, I think it may have been during the Gulf War, I was plodding along from the metro station in Washington to the Commerce Department, and it was raining, and it was a very gloomy day, and of course we were in this war, and this just came to me out of nowhere that war does not mean that God has given up on humankind. It means that humankind has given up on God.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think we could unpack this one sentence for the next hour, right? He blames the Greeks for believing the world was born out of war, which truly many ancient cultures have this idea that the world was born out of war. The gods fight each other, and that's how the world gets born. But no, Judaism says the world was created out of love and serenity and, God wishing to create a vessel for life. That's a very different idea than that war is inevitable in the world. And ultimately his message here is about that that we have this responsibility to make a more peaceful world too. And I'll end with this passage, which comes from the Pittsburgh Principles of Reform Judaism. This is 1999 Pittsburgh versus 1885 Pittsburgh. Although some of the ideas are the same, they use the language of bringing Torah into the world. It says we bring Torah into the world when we strive to fulfill the highest ethical mandates in our relationships with others and with all of God's creation. Partners with God in Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, we are called to help bring nearer the Messianic age. So when will the Messiah come? Today. Today, as soon as we begin to see each other as human, begin to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, begin to see ourselves as having a responsibility and the capacity to repair the world. And on the one hand, that might sound disempowering because it means that you have a lot of work to do. But on the other hand, it's actually quite empowering because it means that you have the power. The power to repair the world is right here in our hands. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for your discussion. I hope this was hopeful, and I really enjoyed unpacking this text with you. I look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time.